blockchain governance has experienced significant sort of semantic drift. It's become disconnected from, it's become sort of unmoored in the general discourse. So we're going to propose a definition and go from there. Let's briefly take a quick look at how sort of major developers of large and profitable projects discuss governance. And you'll find, and all of these quotes come directly from the official websites of these projects, Metronome, Cardano, EOS, Dash, and Decred. One thing you find is that if you sort of scrutinize the claims made about governance, especially when it relates to on-chain votes, you end up with kind of absurdities and nonsense claims, right? So just to briefly scroll through these, the Metronome claim is that there will be virtually no influence from the founders after the launch, which is probably quite unlikely, as the founders are the ones that sort of tend to dictate the way the chain goes. The Cardano folks are claiming that it's going to be democratic, which at present we don't really have the tools to do that in a blockchain context, because we don't really have identity on the blockchain as of yet. There's the EOS folks are claiming that power is vested with token holders, which, again, if you look at the reality of EOS today, the Constitution is sort of being rewritten as we speak. So that's sort of a bit of a tenuous claim. In Dash, the claim is that they're Sybil resistant and that it actually constitutes a fully decentralized organization, which is sort of odd given the scope of the masternode votes on Dash, which are mostly sort of routine budgetary items. And then in Decred, the claim is that you can transition entirely from one system to another, which hasn't yet happened in Decred. Again, they mostly cover budgetary items, or that's actually the plan with Politeia. So this isn't necessarily a critique of these projects, it's just a critique of the discourse, right, as it relates to their governance in particular, especially with on-chain governance. So this is the key claim and contention I want to advance today, that the term has become conceptually stretched, and it's worth sort of returning to what it actually means, hopefully we'll have some positive developments there in the panels later today. So why does this matter, right? So if you think of a blockchain, a public blockchain or crypto asset, cryptocurrency, it's sort of a way to provide very strong assurances with regards to property rights or asset ownership, right? These things provide extremely strong assurances to the extent that if you steal someone's private key, you're considered the de facto owner of that, according to the blockchain, right? So these are sort of global opt-in institutions, and they rigorously define rules that everyone must abide by. But the sort of social rules that are built on top of that are not as rigorously defined, and that's where governance comes in. Someone needs to determine how decisions over the protocol are made, how it progresses to a new set, how updates occur, and that's sort of the squishy social element that needs to be defined. So that's what we talk about when we talk about governance. And when any alteration occurs to these protocols, there are sort of important and dramatic consequences, and there's often winners and losers, right? So with the DAO crisis, the sort of the revocation of the DAO, the block size debate in Bitcoin, the outcome of many of these sort of crises is that there are winners and losers, right? So these are very high stakes sort of debates, and it's sort of important that the folks shepherding the debates establish a high threshold of legitimacy, which is really what I refer to when I talk about governance, is making decisions in a way that your society, your constituents sort of accept those decisions, right? So it's all well and good to have a vote in a real world country, but if there's riots in the streets and tanks rolling through the streets after the election happens, it's considered a failed election, right? And so that's sort of the analog here. You want to have decisions that occur over updates to the protocol, but you also want them to be considered legitimate and accepted, and you don't want them to become too rancorous and end up leading to a chain split or something, right? So if we sort of step back briefly, there's sort of common ways, lots of similes and analogies that are made. So we can briefly appraise those here. So one very common claim is that blockchains or sort of crypto assets are decentralized corporations, right? And the BitShares guys talked about this, and Dash talks about this. Obviously, it's kind of the same notion with the DAOs. You do have some sort of similarities. There's this clear linkage between especially if in an on-chain vote, a clear linkage between token holders as shareholders. There's often appeals to the typical corporate governance that occurs in actual corporations. And you have public offerings, sometimes you have dividends, but also there are massive dissimilarities, right? The analogy sort of falls apart, right? Because if you look at how corporate governance actually works in the real world, it's not really mediated entirely by shareholder votes. In fact, that's a sort of vanishingly small part of it, right? So, and you also have sort of other dissimilarities, like you can't fork a corporation, you can fork a blockchain. Blockchains probably shouldn't have these excessively corporate structures because that's kind of anathema to the goals of the blockchain, which is to be sort of decentralized and resistant to sort of any kind of sort of third-party intervention, right? So it doesn't really make that much sense to conceptualize a crypto asset, cryptocurrency, or blockchain as a pure sort of decentralized corporation, right? And then the other claim that's commonly advanced is these things are like political systems, right? And there's definitely something to be said for that. You have these sort of monetary systems that are exist on an opt-in basis now, right? So typically in meat space, you're born into a political system. You can't really opt in. You're never really given the chance, right? So you sort of implicitly sign that social contract when you're born. And now the alternative is here, you get to choose whether you want to opt in into Zcash's monetary policy or Ethereum's monetary policy or Bitcoin's monetary policy, and whether you embrace and endorse the sort of taxation or the redistributive elements there. And in some cases you have elected representatives, right? That's how delegated systems work, right? And you have constitutions, and crucially you do have shared values that underscore these things. And naturally the main value here is privacy, but that's not the only one, right? So there's definitely something to be said for this when we're considering the analogies where we're going to draw these notions of governance from. So if we're building a governance system for a blockchain, are we going to pull in precedent from corporate governance, or we're going to pull in precedent from sort of political multi-stakeholder governance, right? There's definitely something to be said for this, right? But also there are dissimilarities, right? So we don't have on-chain democracy yet, right? We have on-chain plutocracy, which is definitely suboptimal. And cartels often form in these delegated voting systems. And again, you don't really have that many checks and balances either. We have yet to develop these sort of robust systems which are as functional as, for instance, the US or Canadian governments, right? So here's a definition that we're putting forth in our paper. This is not to disparage other excellent efforts like Vlad Zamfir's definition of blockchain governance, but this is just the one we came up with. How blockchain communities and stakeholders arrive at collective action, especially with respect to protocol change, right? So the routine decisions, you don't need to consult the community for that, right? Although they're pretty entertaining when you're picking a mascot and stuff, right? But the key here is that if you need to coordinate, significant, wide-ranging alterations to the protocol, it's important that you have buy-in and that you retain your legitimacy after those decisions occur, because again, it is so simple and easy to coordinate an exit. And you really don't want to be fragmenting your network, so your design consideration there is how to architect alterations to the protocol that are occurring in a world where your constituents are still maintaining their buy-in, right? So in our context, we're essentially referring to the creation of meta institutions which sit on top of the main institution, which is the blockchain, which sort of just hums along. And now, given this definition, we can attack some misconceptions, right? So some Bitcoiners like to claim that Bitcoin actually doesn't possess governance, which we don't think is the case, right? Governance is opaque, but it's not non-existent, right? It's a little bit difficult to conceptualize. It's sort of informal, and it sort of borrows a lot from the open source world, but it still exists, right? And it's like something you can't really escape, right? There's always going to be decisions that are made over the protocol. The question is, are they made transparently? Are they made with buy-in? Or are they just made sort of by fiat, right? By decree. The other claim that we'd like to push back against is that governance is a technical feature. And that'll harken back to the fourth slide, where the claim is advanced by many newer blockchains that you can just bolt on a voting system of governance. We don't think that's the case, right? we don't think you can just like, do it live and add governance later, right? It has to be this sort of deliberate consultative process, and an on-chain vote doesn't solely constitute governance, right? There's a lot more to it, as the Zcash Foundation knows, right? And then, a final claim is that blockchains don't require governance, much like gold is ungoverned. But ultimately, blockchains are software, and software needs to be updated, and someone needs to mediate those updates. And someone needs to pick the winners and losers, right? And often if you have a significant debate, there will be winners and losers, as I said, and those decisions need to be made with sort of community buy-in, right? So even though it's nice to believe that, decisions are merely routine in technical projects, we don't think that's really the case. These are sort of wide-ranging, global economic and political institutions, and the debates are extremely high stakes, right? So here's a brief sort of taxonomy of on-chain governance. Some of you might be surprised that I've popped the Ethereum and the Bitcoin logos up there. Ethereum, as some of us know, had sort of non-binding votes. Back when there was the DAO crisis, there was the carbon vote, which was a non-binding vote, which was sort of used to poll the community. Although that's sort of mostly been retired now, because there was fairly low quorums there, so there wasn't enough engagement for that to be a useful signal from the community. You can contest this, but the block signaling in Bitcoin sort of acted as a sort of non-binding vote, although BIP 148 maybe it did constitute binding, but we're just creating a basic rough sketch here. Dash, Decred, and Pivx and other masternode schemes, they have direct votes, so there's no delegation there. And if you own a masternode in Pivx or Dash, you can vote directly on what you want to do from a budgetary context, and that's roughly the same in Decred. And then you have these delegative systems like EOS and BitShares and Cardano, where you typically would vote for a representative. So that's just sort of a basic taxonomy there. But as I've said and alluded to, there are definitely significant drawbacks there, possibly so significant that it's almost not worth instituting an on-chain voting scheme at present, right? So as I said before, on-chain votes or shareholder votes, right, which are the analogy for token holder votes, they're just one piece of how corporate governance works, if that's your preferred analogy. And if you actually look how corporations are governed these days, you don't really have these rolling, Apple shareholders don't, vote continuously for Apple's budgetary decisions and supply chain decisions. That's just not how it works, right? You have sort of boards of directors, and you have, the C-suite, and you have activist shareholders, right? So, and that's actually sort of an important point. To the extent that shareholder governance occurs in corporations, it's often mediated through large block holders, right? Like hedge funds that are activist hedge funds that are trying to bully the leadership into doing something or other. So to me, it seems like sort of a cargo cult imitation of how actual corporate governance occurs in the real world. Most of the time, you don't really have, retail shareholders of publicly traded stocks actually voting on sort of budgetary decisions at all, right? And then you have the other common drawbacks. Voters tend to be pretty apathetic. There's no aspersions there. It's just that oftentimes having to vote exposes your keys, and maybe that interferes with your cold wallet solutions, and you don't really want to do that. You definitely have these cartels that get formed, and often they're sort of formed and they're hard to detect, which makes them sort of even more insidious. You have these non-representative votes. If you look at EOS, it's very difficult to see who's voting for what and who's behind those votes. It's just more difficult to police how your representatives are voting. And they tend to be inefficient. And of course, if you want to run a Dash masternode, you need about $300,000, right? So they're not necessarily that available to normal folks. And then, the other side of governance, probably the more important side, is this sort of off-chain stuff. And we here in our paper, we're distinguishing it from the sort of typical free and open source governance structures, which you can find. There's a very robust literature there. We think there are sort of key distinctions, right? So the stakes tend to be higher in cryptocurrency projects, right? And these protocols are directly monetized. It's very convenient to look at the way that things work in the open source world and be like, well, let's just recapture those same governance structures and borrow those. But I think it becomes a little bit more complicated. for a variety of reasons, right? So the stakes might be high for commit rights to the Linux GitHub distro because like Linux is massively influential software, but the lines of code themselves are not sort of directly financialized as they are in Bitcoin or Zcash, right? Oftentimes in open source, the users, the contributors are themselves the end users, right? So they're sort of conjoined in a sense. But in a world of Zcash, for instance, the people writing the software are not necessarily the end users. The end users are this broad constituency of people worldwide who need privacy for some reason, right? So you have to sort of bridge that gap, and you have to make deliberate outreach efforts to sort of find your constituency and incorporate their decisions into the way that things happen. So we think there are sort of significant dissimilarities there, especially with regards to the stakes being higher. Because I said these are sort of global institutions, potentially global new monetary standards, and they're not sort of just mere software projects. They do have significant redistributive outcomes. So we're going to segment the mechanisms here into sort of the implementation, which is sort of typically well understood, right? How changes to the main repository are mediated, and oftentimes that is something that's sort of clearly sketched out and well understood. And if you ask someone how Bitcoin's governance works, for instance, they might tell you, like, first you socialize your prospect on the mailing list, and then you receive soft consensus, and then you write up a proposal, and then you create a BIP, right? So that's typically quite well understood. But then sort of equally important is this community outreach, which needs to occur. And in fact, that's what's occurring right now in Zcash. So I want to commend Josh Cincinnati and the foundation for sort of actively doing that, because it's something that's not commonly seen in the industry, right? So that is vital to retain legitimacy, and that's really the chief challenge. How do you ensure that you have buy-in from your user base and the key stakeholders, even if you're making these sort of dramatic and difficult decisions, and there might be significant alterations to the code base, right? And this community level mechanisms that we're referring to, that even stretches as far to is what is the value system? What are the core values that we're enshrining here, right? So this is sort of a very important consideration that we think has often been overlooked. So just some brief thoughts to editorialize here. If you ask someone in the industry, what or how blockchains are governed, they'll often tell you how they think they should be governed, rather than giving you sort of a descriptive answer. And I think it's very important to be honest about where power truly resides in these systems. The sort of seductive, oftentimes you'll find these creators of these systems trying to obscure the nexuses of power by sort of, inserting a on-chain vote, and then they'll point to that and they'll say, here is the governance. This is where decisions are made. This is where power is vested. And I think that's that sort of often is a deliberate attempt to obscure who truly controls the chain, right? Currently, we don't really have any on-chain vote systems that are functional and have decoupled from the sort of stewardship of the chain by major developers. So at present, it's a little bit illegitimate to say that on-chain votes solely constitute governance. Maybe we're going to progress to a world like that, but right now it's important to sort of elucidate where the key power structures really reside. The more complexity and the more obscurity, the more that there are opportunities for the protocol designers to enrich themselves and their friends, right? Referring back to the analogies and the disanalogies, it's important to situate governance in context. So look for, we're not reinventing the wheel here. There have been thousands of years of work on sort of coordinating many stakeholders. So find analogies, find prior art, and try and obtain and retain buy-in from the community. I think absolutely key to this is establishing shared norms and values that you can sort of use to situate the debate, so that there are some things that are not to be argued over, and then you can argue over the more difficult things. Be inclusive, not radically inclusive. We don't need to generalize Zcash to the whole world, but to the people that might actually want to use it. Engage stakeholders in a formal sense and obtain buy-in is really key, and that's what's happening in the governance panel. And I'm a full disclosure member of that governance panel, and it was a great experience, and I hope that they keep growing it to include as many people as possible. be transparent, and be accountable. So this is a draft paper which we're happy to, if you enjoyed any of the thoughts or disagreed with them, I'd be happy to hear from you, and we should be publishing it soon. And I'm happy to introduce David Vork next.